Inside Attica Prison, the anatomy of control. Foundations of power. In September 1971, one of the deadliest prison uprisings in American history unfolded inside a maximum security facility in upstate New York. When it ended, 43 people were dead, 33 incarcerated men and 10 hostages. The prison was called Attica. More than 5 decades later, Attica remains one of the most studied correctional institutions in the United States. Not just because of what happened during those 4 days in 1971, but because of what the prison represented, a tightly controlled system built on rigid discipline, racial imbalance, overcrowding, and near-total authority over human lives. Tonight, we go inside Attica Correctional Facility to examine what it really is, how it was built, how it functioned, and how control became its defining architecture. If you value deeply researched, factual prison documentaries, support this channel. Like this video and subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. Your support helps us continue producing long-form, evidence-based stories like this one. This is not myth. This is not legend. This is the documented anatomy of control. The birth of a fortress. Attica Correctional Facility opened in 1931 in Attica, New York, about 30 miles east of Buffalo. It was constructed during a period when American penal philosophy emphasized discipline, isolation, and industrial labor. The prison was designed to house approximately 2,000 men. Its architecture reflected early 20th century correctional thinking: thick concrete walls, cell blocks radiating from central corridors, elevated gun towers positioned at strategic corners. Attica was built to project permanence and authority. From the beginning, it was classified as a maximum security institution under the New York State Department of Correctional Services, now known as the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, DOCCS. The facility was not built as an experimental reform institution. It was built to contain. Its structure alone communicated the message: control would not be negotiated. Conditions before the uprising. By the late 1960s, Attica housed more than 2,200 incarcerated men, exceeding its intended capacity. Official reports and later investigations documented several conditions that contributed to rising tensions. 1 shower per week was permitted. Toilet paper was limited to 1 roll per month. Inmates earned as little as 6 to 29 cents per day for prison labor. Male censorship policies were in place. A significant racial imbalance existed. Approximately 54% of the incarcerated population was Black or Latino, while nearly all correctional officers were white. These figures were documented in state reports and later confirmed by investigative journalism and the McKay Commission. Medical care, educational programming, and grievance procedures were widely described by incarcerated men as inadequate. While prison officials at the time maintained that policies complied with state standards, dissatisfaction inside the walls was increasing. Across the United States, prisons were experiencing unrest during this period. Attica was not isolated from broader national tensions of the late 1960s and early 1970s. But inside Attica, authority was centralized and rigid. Officers controlled movement, communication, labor assignments, and discipline. Control was absolute, until it wasn't. September 9, 1971. On the morning of September 9, 1971, a confrontation between incarcerated men and correctional officers escalated. Within hours, inmates had taken control of a large section of the prison known as the Yard. 38 correctional officers and civilian employees were taken hostage. The takeover was not spontaneous chaos. Within hours, inmates formed a leadership structure. They issued a list of demands, later known as the Attica Liberation Faction demands. These included improved medical care, fair wages for prison labor, religious freedom, an end to what they described as brutal treatment, political rights and amnesty for the uprising participants. Negotiations began between inmate representatives and state officials. Observers were brought in, including journalists and civil rights advocates. For 4 days, the prison yard became a negotiation zone under armed surveillance from state police and National Guard troops positioned outside. Governor Nelson Rockefeller did not visit the prison during the standoff. His decision has been documented and later scrutinized, though the motivations behind it remain debated. By September 13, negotiations had stalled. At 9:46 a.m., state authorities launched an armed retaking of the facility. The retaking. State police and National Guard forces entered the yard after tear gas was deployed. The retaking lasted approximately 15 minutes. When it ended, 43 people were dead. According to official autopsy reports, all 39 deaths that occurred during the assault, 29 inmates and 10 hostages, were caused by gunfire from law enforcement personnel. 4 additional inmates had died earlier in the uprising. Initial public statements incorrectly suggested that hostages had their throats cut by inmates. Subsequent medical examinations disproved this claim. The deaths were caused by bullets. The misinformation was widely reported before being corrected. The McKay Commission later concluded that excessive force had been used and criticized state authorities for failures in planning and communication. No state police officers were criminally convicted for the deaths. Over decades, civil lawsuits resulted in financial settlements for families of victims and former hostages. The uprising permanently altered how prisons were discussed in America, but it did not dismantle the control structures inside Attica. It reinforced them. Aftermath, reform and resistance. Following the uprising, New York State implemented several reforms. Increased oversight of prison conditions. Expansion of grievance procedures. Some improvements to visitation policies. Greater attention to medical and educational programming. However, systemic change was gradual and uneven. Academic research in the decades following Attica shows that while reforms were introduced, maximum security prisons across the United States increasingly adopted more sophisticated control measures. These included enhanced surveillance, segregated housing units, tactical response teams, structured disciplinary systems. Attica remained operational as a maximum security facility. The architecture stayed the same. The walls remained. Control evolved. But it did not disappear. Attica today. Today, Attica Correctional Facility remains active under the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. It houses incarcerated men classified under maximum security protocols. Exact population numbers fluctuate year to year and are publicly documented in DOCCS reports. Modern Attica includes electronic surveillance systems, structured program schedules, formal grievance channels, expanded medical services compared to the 1970s. However, like many maximum security institutions, it continues to operate under strict movement controls, tiered housing classifications, and centralized authority. Attica is no longer defined solely by 1971. But 1971 still defines Attica. Because the uprising exposed what happens when control is absolute, and when those inside the system believe they have no voice within it. And this is where the deeper question begins. What does control actually look like, day to day, inside a maximum security prison? The geometry of confinement. Attica's design is not accidental. Its architecture is part of its control system. Constructed in 1931, the facility follows a traditional cell block model: long linear corridors, stacked tiers of cells, central officer stations, and restricted movement corridors connecting housing units to yards and program areas. Cells in older maximum security facilities like Attica are typically narrow, originally built to house one person. In periods of overcrowding, double celling has occurred in New York State prisons, though housing policies fluctuate depending on population levels and administrative decisions. Every movement inside Attica is structured. Housing units are locked and unlocked according to schedule. Meals are either delivered to units or accessed through escorted movement. Recreation periods are timed and supervised. Count procedures occur multiple times per day. The physical structure reinforces hierarchy. Officers maintain visibility from elevated positions. Doors are electronically controlled in many areas. Segmented corridors prevent unrestricted travel. Unlike modern pod-based designs used in some newer prisons, Attica's layout reflects an older philosophy: linear observation and centralized control. Space itself becomes a tool. Classification. Who goes where? Before an incarcerated person arrives at Attica, they undergo classification within the New York State correctional system. Classification determines security level, housing assignment, program eligibility, work assignments, supervision intensity. Attica is designated as a maximum security facility. Individuals housed there typically include those serving long sentences, including life sentences, or those assessed as requiring the highest level of custody. Classification decisions in New York are based on current conviction, criminal history, institutional behavior, escape risk, disciplinary record. These assessments are governed by DOCCS policy directives and subject to periodic review. However, academic research has shown that classification systems, while standardized on paper, can be influenced by subjective assessments of behavior and risk. Once assigned to Attica, an individual's movement within the facility continues to depend on conduct, disciplinary history, and program participation. Classification is not just paperwork. It determines access to work, to programs, to privileges, and sometimes, to relative safety. The Special Housing Unit, SHU. Within Attica exists a more restrictive environment, the Special Housing Unit, commonly referred to as SHU. SHU is used for disciplinary segregation or administrative confinement. Individuals may be placed in SHU for violent conduct, possession of contraband, assault, refusal to obey orders, or, in some cases, for protective custody. Conditions in SHU typically involve 23-hour per day cell confinement, limited recreation, often alone, restricted visitation, reduced access to programs. New York State has implemented reforms in recent years, including the HALT Solitary Confinement Act, which limits the length and conditions of segregated confinement. As of implementation in 2022, the law restricts most solitary confinement placements to 15 consecutive days. How consistently reforms are applied in practice has been subject to advocacy scrutiny and legislative review. SHU represents the most concentrated form of control inside Attica. It is the enforcement mechanism behind institutional order. Surveillance, seen at all times. Surveillance inside Attica has evolved significantly since 1971. In the early 1970s, observation depended primarily on physical patrols and tower guards. Today, electronic monitoring supplements human oversight. Cameras are installed in many common areas, corridors, and external perimeters. Control rooms monitor activity in real time. Additionally, movement is logged. Visitor entries are documented. Phone calls may be recorded, subject to policy. Mail is screened under established guidelines. New York correctional policy permits monitoring of non-legal mail and recorded calls, with legal communications protected under confidentiality rules. Surveillance is not simply about preventing escape. It is about maintaining internal order. Every routine, from meal distribution to recreation, is tracked. In maximum security facilities like Attica, visibility is a core principle. If control is architecture, surveillance is its nervous system. Labor and institutional economy. Labor has long been central to prison management in the United States. At Attica, incarcerated individuals may work in maintenance, food services, industrial shops, facility upkeep, Educational support roles. Compensation for prison labor in New York State remains significantly below minimum wage. According to publicly documented wage schedules, incarcerated workers may earn between a few cents to slightly over $1 per hour, depending on assignment and tier level. Wages can be used for commissary purchases, phone calls, or saved within institutional accounts. Prison labor serves multiple functions. Operational maintenance of the facility. Skill development for some participants. Behavioral incentive structure. Critics argue compensation levels are insufficient. State officials maintain that wages reflect institutional structure and that basic needs, housing, food, clothing, are provided. Labor, like classification, operates as both function and leverage. It rewards compliance. It structures time. It reinforces control. Discipline and due process. When a rule is allegedly violated inside Attica, a disciplinary process begins. This typically includes a written misbehavior report, a hearing before a designated officer, opportunity for the incarcerated individual to respond, potential sanctions if found guilty. Sanctions may include loss of privileges, loss of good time credit, SHU placement, program removal. Due process protections in prison disciplinary hearings are limited compared to criminal court proceedings. The U.S. Supreme Court established in Wolf v. McDonnell, 1974, that incarcerated individuals are entitled to certain minimal procedural safeguards, but not full constitutional trial rights. New York state policy incorporates these standards. Advocacy organizations have periodically challenged disciplinary practices, alleging inconsistencies or procedural concerns. DOCS maintains that hearings comply with legal requirements. Discipline inside Attica operates within a formal structure. But the power imbalance remains significant. Control is backed by written procedure, and enforced by confinement. Use of force. Use of force policies inside New York prisons are governed by state directive. Correctional officers are authorized to use force when preventing escape, defending themselves or others, enforcing lawful orders, suppressing disturbances. Force must be documented through written reports and subject to review. Body cameras have been implemented in some New York correctional contexts, though deployment has been phased and subject to policy changes. Historically, allegations of excessive force have led to investigations and lawsuits, including cases involving Attica. In 2000, New York State agreed to a civil settlement related to claims of abuse following the 1971 uprising. Additional settlements have occurred in later decades regarding unrelated incidents. Official records indicate that use of force incidents are tracked and reviewed administratively. Advocacy groups continue to call for expanded transparency. Force is the final layer of control. It exists as policy and as history. Medical and mental health services. Medical services in New York State prisons are overseen by correctional health providers under state contracts. At Attica, services include routine medical care, emergency treatment, mental health services, chronic disease management. In the decades following the 1971 uprising, medical access was cited as one of the primary grievances raised by incarcerated men. Today, DOCCS publishes healthcare standards aligned with state guidelines. However, oversight bodies and legal advocacy organizations have at times reported delays in care, staffing shortages, or systemic challenges common across correctional systems nationwide. Healthcare in prison operates under constraint. Security priorities intersect with medical access. Appointments require escort. Movement is scheduled. Even care exists within control. The culture of control. Attica is not defined by a single policy or a single event. It is defined by structure. Schedules regulate waking hours. Counts verify presence. Classification dictates status. Surveillance tracks movement. Discipline enforces compliance. Force stands behind it all. Since 1971, reforms have reshaped elements of the system. Legal standards have evolved. Oversight mechanisms have expanded. Yet the essential purpose of Attica remains unchanged. To confine individuals assessed as requiring maximum security. Control is not incidental. It is the operating principle. But control inside prison is not static. It responds to law, politics, public scrutiny, and internal resistance. National shockwaves. The events at Attica in September 1971 did not remain confined to Western New York. They triggered national debate. The official investigation, known as the McKay Commission, criticized state officials for the retaking operation, failures in communication, and broader systemic issues within the prison system. In the years that followed, prison reform became a subject of federal and state legislative discussion. Oversight of correctional facilities increased. Grievance systems were formalized. Court rulings expanded limited due process rights for incarcerated individuals. At the same time, the 1970s and 1980s saw a dramatic expansion of incarceration in the United States. Maximum security facilities multiplied. Supermax prisons emerged. Surveillance technology advanced. Attica exposed institutional control. But it did not dismantle it. It reshaped it. Legal battles and accountability. For decades after 1971, legal battles continued. Civil lawsuits filed by former hostages and incarcerated men alleged excessive force and mistreatment during and after the retaking. In 2000, New York State agreed to a $12 million settlement in a civil case brought by former inmates. In 2005, the state agreed to an $8 million settlement for former hostages and their families. No state officials were criminally convicted for the deaths that occurred during the retaking. These outcomes remain part of Attica's public record. The legal aftermath demonstrated something critical. Control inside prison may be immediate. Accountability, if it comes, is often slow. Attica in the modern era. Attica Correctional Facility remains operational today under the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. It continues to house men classified at maximum security. Reforms such as the HALT Solitary Confinement Act reflect ongoing efforts to limit prolonged isolation. Oversight mechanisms exist that did not in 1971. Yet the structure remains unmistakable. Walls. Towers. Controlled movement. Restricted liberty. Attica is no longer defined solely by uprising. It is defined by endurance. The anatomy of control, architecture, classification, surveillance, discipline, continues to function as designed. What changed was not the existence of control. What changed was the visibility of it. The meaning of control. Attica is not just a prison. It is a case study in power, how institutions maintain order, how authority is structured, and what happens when control meets resistance. In 1971, the world saw inside. Since then, the systems have evolved, but the central question remains. How much control is necessary, and at what cost? The walls still stand. The schedules still run. The counts still happen. And Attica remains a living institution shaped by its past. If you found this deep dive valuable, support the Inmate Diaries by liking this video and subscribing. Thank you for watching.